Hello, welcome to the Learning Playlist, a podcast for the major and general education courses under the tutelage of Mr. Ryan Dave Rayla, USJR College Instructor. This project is a supplement to the said courses and as a means to share knowledge to the public at large. To help the podcast grow, kindly follow us at facebook.com/the learning playlist. And now, on to our show. Hello everyone, and welcome once again to another lecture in the contemporary world. For today's lecture, we're going to talk about Lesson 5, Global Governance. So to begin with, what is global governance in the first place? Well, global governance is a necessary and very important feature of our discussion here in contemporary world. Primarily because global governance is not simply governance among states or between states, but rather it now involves a complex array of global actors that have contributed to much of the development in the world today, ranging from the social to the political, even to the economic and beyond. Global governance, as we know it, is now dominated by several key actors that we need to know about. First, we have states, the traditional actors of global governance. Second, we have NGOs or non-government organizations. We also have intergovernment organizations, IGOs, which are basically composed of states. And then we also have multinational corporations. So in our highly interconnected world of globalization today, governance is not simply a matter of individual states, nor is it simply a domestic matter anymore. With the rise of challenges such as climate change and many other human security issues like food security, water security, and many others, which we shall call together as common goods problem, governance is no longer just the concern of individual states or of individuals themselves, but rather governance is the concern of everyone. And therefore, in this so-called global village that we have under globalization, governance is something that is of common interest to all. So this has something to do with public affairs, with questions and with problems that matter to the public in general. And therefore, understanding global governance is not simply a concern of, let's say, macro matters, no, but it also devolves or it also involves individual concerns that affect us directly today. So by the end of this lecture, we hope to achieve these learning outcomes, and primarily we hope to discuss not only about global governance but how interstate governance transformed to global governance and why this important transformation occurred, especially during the time of contemporary globalization as we know it. Understanding all of this would help us understand the future modules or the other modules for the midterms period. In particular, it will help us understand the paradigm of sustainability and sustainable development goals, and also it will help us understand what are common goods problem and the so-called global divide that affects our world today, especially us here in the global south, those who live in the underdeveloped side of the world, no, in underdeveloped countries who have to face numerous challenges ranging from food security to water security and many others. So as you remember from the previous lectures on traditional security versus, or rather from traditional security to human security, we have discussed how the focus of states have transformed from focusing on traditional security, which is basically security in the form of safety from invasions by other states, to human security, which talks about giving primacy to how communities and how individuals secure themselves from numerous challenges ranging from food to water security, and many others, we are now transforming, or rather, we are now looking into interstate governance, moving forward to global governance. So, how did this change occur in the first place? Well, by the time of the 20th century, basically the previous 100 years, we have seen the rise of numerous organizations that not only rival states in terms of their power, but also have challenged the primary paradigm of realism in its interpretation of the world, coming from the assumption that there is anarchy. Now, in this sense, we are going to look at again the transformation of governance from interstate to global governance from the paradigm of liberalism. So, if you remember from the previous lectures, liberalism emphasizes on the possibility of cooperation via economic interdependence and, of course, via other means of interdependence as well. So as you can see, at the turn of the 20th century, primary actors such as states are being challenged by non-state actors. You have, for example, by the end of the First World War, the very first interstate or intergovernmental organization, which is the League of Nations, which was primarily aimed at creating the notion of collective security, wherein states can no longer use war as an instrument of aggressive foreign policy, to get what they want. And because in the previous century, as we have seen in the First and the Second World Wars, we have seen the rise of total war, of warfare that is largely unmitigated. And of course, by the end of the Second World War, we have seen the rise of nuclear warfare. And this has drastically increased the cost of warfare and has basically put a cap on what states can do in terms of war. So it has increased the cost of war over its benefits, and therefore many other actors on the world stage became prominent alongside states, not only to curb war, but also to take advantages of new developments post 1945. In particular, there have been many institutions created to mitigate not only war, but to focus states on what is important today, and that is development, rather than going to war against one another. They now have to focus on developing their countries in terms of raising standards of living, human living standards, in terms of protecting the environment, in terms of so many other concerns that have previously been overshadowed by the threat of war. So in this sense, we are seeing that NGOs and IGOs are growing in influence because national governments are now focusing more on development, as we have seen in the previous decades following the Second World War. And so, coming from this traumatic experience of warfare, there is a need, or there has been rather a strong desire to curb anarchy and to promote economic interdependence as an alternative to a world that is increasingly, or that was increasingly, at war with itself. Now, on a side note, not to add relevance to this discussion, currently we are seeing the problem of, or rather, we are seeing the crisis of the Russian invasion of Ukraine as some sort of a harkening back to the world of the First and the Second World War, wherein war was a primary instrument of states to get what they want. And many have argued, and I will let you watch a video on this one. Many have argued that globalization has effectively came to an end with the crisis in Ukraine, but that is still a very disputed, very contested point, no, or argument that is relevant right now and is continuing on the world stage. But what is important when analyzing interstate governance to global governance today is the fact that states are no longer alone, but rather there is a plethora or an array of other actors that have come to shape global governance as we know it today. So we have here some examples of what we call as global intergovernmental organizations, no, or intergovernmental organizations, IGOs. So, what are the purpose of IGOs? In particular, IGOs are meant as organizations to allow states to cooperate, to allow them to come together and perhaps even pool their resources in terms of the United Nations, and preceding that, um, the League of Nations, no, that was before the United Nations was established after the Second World War. Unfortunately for the League of Nations, it failed in its mandate to prevent another world war from erupting, no, around the 1930s, in particular when Germany, Japan, and Italy left this organization. And there's a very telling statement on that one by the dictator Benito Mussolini, in which he said, the League of Nations is good when sparrows speak, but it is no good when eagles fall out. Meaning, when international powers, or rather when global powers such as the United States, Russia, and many other countries, Great Britain, for example, and France, when they have major disagreements, certainly the League of Nations failed to prevent them from going to war against one another. And I think this is also a reality in our world today, wherein the United Nations has basically failed to stop Russia from aggressively invading, no, from aggressively invading Ukraine. And it also has the current United Nations also has failed 20 years before from stopping the United States from unilaterally or from invading Afghanistan and Iraq, no, in the wake of the tragedy of September 11, 2001. So in this sense, there are many shortcomings to international there are many shortcomings to intergovernmental organizations. However, this doesn't mean that they are ineffective, no? There are so many other functions of these organizations than just preventing war. They are here to, for example, to promote development among different countries by providing them loans in the form of the IMF and the World Bank, and by allowing them avenues to actually trade with other countries like the World Trade Organization, that has international regimes and mechanisms to allow these. We shall be talking about international regimes soon enough. Okay, and in particular, intergovernmental organizations are very crucial. They are basically the backbone of today's international order. Now, there are also regional intergovernmental organizations. In contrast to global international or global intergovernmental organizations, these regional organizations are limited by their geographic reach. In particular, they look into, or rather, they are organizations that cater to certain regions around the globe. Like, for example, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations is exclusively for states within the geographic location of Southeast Asia. And then we have the European Union, which caters to European states, no, or European peoples. And then we have Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, which caters to the greater region of maritime Asia Pacific. And there's also the African Union, no? So it caters to, of course, states within Africa. Overall, what we are seeing here in terms of regional intergovernmental organizations is the fact that their scope is a bit limited. But does it mean that they are less powerful than global IGOs? In a sense, they can be found within the orbit or within the general framework of international organizations, the global ones, that is, like the United Nations. In particular, they also have frameworks or agreements between IGOs, no, on the global scale, and then here's the regional scale as well. But in general, these are meant primarily as forums or let's say mechanisms to facilitate cooperation among states on the level of the region, no, and they are very important today in a sense that they set major economic, social, and even military policies that are still with us here. Now, let's look at non-governmental organizations. So, as the name suggests, this is rather different from the IGOs that we have discussed on the regional and global level. Uh, Non-governmental organizations, they can be as vast as international or global organizations like the International Red Cross, or they can be limited to certain geographic areas alone. However, when we talk about non-governmental organization, there is one crucial difference that we need to know, and that is non-governmental organizations, in contrast to IGOs or intergovernmental organizations, they are not created by governments. Rather, they are created by civil movements or grassroots, and they are usually funded through different means rather than from revenue of states, no, from taxes. So these organizations are not bound by the agendas of states, but rather they are created to serve certain purposes that are, perhaps you can say, humanitarian in nature, and even purposes that are also catering to common goods problem on a global scale. No, for example, you have Greenpeace that promotes the protection of the environment and of course of the flora and fauna within it. No, so animals and plant protection. There's also Transparency International, which is basically an organization that tries to check governments per se in terms of their practices, not only against corruption but also in terms of their practices in relation to human rights. For example, have there been abuses, etc., etc. There are many organizations that are included in the category of non-governmental organizations. What we need to know about them in particular is that these are not state actors. No, these are not state actors. These are mostly created by civil organizations that have advocacies that are humanitarian in nature, and they are non-profit in general. No? Well, rather, all of them are non-profit. We shall distinguish later on the difference between NGOs and multinational corporations. So, as we can see now, um, intergovernmental organizations and NGOs do exist in a common international system. No, they exist together in the international system. Are there any bridges or are there any linkages between them? Yes. Primarily, we have an example here that says, for instance, funds of World Bank projects are disbursed through NGOs. And this is correct, no? Although primarily when we look at projects of a global scale, let's say, for example, the funding of major infrastructure around the world, these are usually done through interstate agreements. Let's say, for example, bilateral agreements that China conducts today among states like, say, states like Africa, the Philippines, no, or rather states in Africa. Africa is not a state, by the way. It's a region, no? It's a continent. So to correct on that one, no, to be sure. Um, in this way, we can see that while states are still the primary actors on the international stage, it doesn't mean that they are actors that are, or rather, they are the only ones here. And more importantly, it doesn't mean that they are the only ones facilitating the movement of resources and many other aspects of the international system. IGOs, intergovernmental organizations, and NGOs play a huge part in this interconnected world of ours. No, so they are part of it, and they are increasingly becoming more and more enmeshed together to the point that states cannot act independently without NGOs, and that NGOs cannot act without states. So there are many examples of this, and as we go through the modules and as you conduct your case studies, you will see this act out or being played out in real time as the case studies would suggest, no? Here we see the link, or rather here we see the primary framework of human security most at work. In this lecture, we are talking about global governance, but within global governance, human security is a huge framework. It is a huge lens of trying to understand, or of understanding where the world is going today. So in terms of security issues, or rather in terms of issue areas in general, we see global governance having many aspects of this, from traditional security to human security. And it covers not only states, but now it covers communities, individuals, and many other interests that transcends not only states, but also transcends the boundaries of uh, of of regions. No, so these are global concerns. So as you can see, global governance is a huge concern, or rather, it's a huge area of study that we can engage in and that we find ourselves in today. So it's not simply abstract for us, but rather it can be very personal to us as well. So there are many issues, and I want you to think about issues that are personal to you right now, issues that affect you, but are also issues that are global in scale, because these issues are not simply they're not simply limited, but rather these are constantly evolving and becoming a huge part of the way that we live today. Personally, on my end, since I'm writing a thesis about this one, water is a personal issue as well as a global issue for me as well. So from that perspective, you can see, or from that example, you can see where I am coming from, no? So this is how issues are to be thought of today. They're not just something that individuals like you and I suffer from, but this is systemic, and they require systemic solutions rather than haphazard individual solutions that are nothing more than band-aid. So global governance now, since it primarily promotes cooperation among states, and not only among states but also among the different actors of the international system. For example, it promotes cooperation among intergovernmental organizations. It promotes cooperation among NGOs, for example. There is now a global consensus, or a growing understanding, and a growing, let's say, how do we say consensus in another term? A growing agreement in support of peaceful means for dispute resolution, and of course, the respect for global rule of law, rather than resorting to the traditional method of waging war to resolve differences. So as you can see, from the perspective of liberalism, although realism is still very present today and very relevant, from the perspective of liberalism, we are seeing that global governance is promoting the kind of ideal that has been touted in the past and that has been viewed as idealistic. But right now, it is becoming more and more a global reality. Cooperation is now more possible than ever, thanks to the rise of intergovernmental organizations and the many mechanisms that they allow. And in this pursuit, they are not alone. States and government and NGOs and even MNCs, multinational corporations, are also working towards the global goal of development, of basically allowing countries to move beyond their interdependencies of, let's say, of core periphery structures, no, of countries becoming nothing more than supplier of raw goods and materials to more developed states. So it's no longer, it's, although it's still a reality today, it is no longer simply acceptable, but there is a growing agreement now that states must develop, that states can develop, and that states should develop, not only in terms of developing alone, but they must develop together to create a better world. And so, in terms of these goals and objectives of states, in terms of this general idea of globalization and development, we are we are most fortunate to see this rise of global governance today. So now we are going to talk about regimes, as I promised earlier. So what are regimes? Basically, here's a definition of regimes that I'm going to read to you. These are set of implicit and explicit principles, norms, rules, decision-making procedures around which actors, or rather the states, NGOs, IGOs, expectations converge in a given area of international relations. In short, these are frameworks, or these are acceptable means of conduct, no, between states. So regimes are there to set what can be done and what should be done and what should not be done in international relations and in global governance in particular. So these are the ways of how we, as NGOs, as states, as intergovernmental organizations, these are ways of how states, how these actors on the international stage are supposed to work together and how they are to act in terms of pursuing the numerous agendas on the international order, no? So it's not just the agenda of global governance, but how states in particular, no, the most powerful and the primary actors of the international system, how they are to pursue their own interests. So here we see, for example, in terms of global regimes, here we see the perspective of liberal institutionalism, wherein major actors, or wherein the global actors are, let's say, their actions are filtered through, or their actions are put into a set of expectations, of frameworks that allows them to cooperate, no? So we can call it, for sake of levity of sorts lang in this discussion, we can call this regimes as the accepted forms of behavior, no, basically your good manners and right conduct, if that applies to if we view states as individuals, not only states but global actors in general, the NGOs, IGOs, etc. So we have here the four defining elements of what a regime is. Basically, we break them down into certain components as suggested by Stephen Krasner. So, for example, we have principles at first, wherein these coherent bodies are rather these are, let's say, these are not only expectations, but these are articulated ideas as to how states and the different actors alongside states should operate within the international system, no? So here we have an example of the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs that operates on liberal principles. Okay, so it operates on the idea of free trade, which in itself derives from the largely liberalist idea of cooperation coming from economic interdependence, no? Then we have also norms. So norms are basically standards of behavior. Again, GRMC, as we stated earlier, no, good manners, right conducts for states, and they identify certain obligations and certain rights of states. No, so what can be done by states and what states are obliged to do. So these are expectations largely, but in the form of conduct, in the form of how states ought to operate, no, amongst themselves, and not only states but also NGOs and many other international actors. But take note of this though. States are the actors that are most likely to be binded by principles and norms and by regimes in general all over the world, because they enter into agreements that allow them to not only cooperate but allow them to check one another. So coming from the assumption again of international anarchy, coming from realism, this sort of binding agreements of norms, this mitigates the kind of chaos that is envisioned by the realist thinkers in terms of anarchy. No, it provides structures as to how states cooperate with one another. And so, in this sense, regimes are important cornerstones of the international system because it allows states, or it anchors states as to what kind of behavior they should do. It basically gives them the kind of guidance, the kind of kanang structure per se that allows them to operate efficiently and effectively amongst one another. Also, NGOs are bound by these regimes. However, there are certain limitations to that one as well, no, and that is still a huge part of the global debate as to what NGOs can do and cannot do, especially in today's contemporary world. So this is what's happening right now with regimes in terms that are these are more of the let's say concrete examples of how regimes affect states in not only states but NGOs also. In general, there are rules that are operational in terms of how conduct of how international actors conduct themselves on a more formal manner when they deal with one another in major forums like the United Nations General Assembly and many other IGOs, ASEAN, for example. There are certain rules that must be followed, etc., etc. There are different principles that are now distilled into rules that allow states to facilitate their movements and their to facilitate how they pursue their interests, no. So in particular, you might notice, why am I always referring to states? Because again, states are the ones that are most subject to international regimes. For decision-making procedures, again, this is another distillation of the principles that regimes are founded upon, and these are identified as specific prescriptions for behavior. For example, how countries can pursue proposals, and how they can, for example, put forth agreements that are binding and perhaps beneficial for them. No, although in the real world we see states jockeying for position and power as they have, but at least they're not jockeying for position and power in the form of pursuing war. No, interstate wars are now quite rare, with the exception of course, the most recent one in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, no, in February 24, 2022. International regimes are primarily beneficial for the international system, no, because it allows cooperation. So here we see how cooperation is actually fostered on an international level, not just on the abstract sense in which we've been discussing about liberalism in the previous lectures, but rather we are seeing now the nitty-gritty, or the details, the finer details of cooperation among states via regimes, no, like human rights regimes, for example. What kind of human rights should be available across states? That's a huge example of international regimes. International regimes induce transparency among states. For example, there are certain requirements among states that for example, uh, that gives them that promotes trust among them, no, like for example, we have what we call kind of structural adjustment programs that basically says that states, before they can loan for development like infrastructure loans, they must show that they have this kind of degree of democracy, that they have this kind of mechanism to promote or to protect against, no, not to promote but to protect against corruption within states, etc., etc. And because of this transparency, and because of the show of trust among states in particular, and NGOs as well, we have, for example, confidence building measures. It gives states the confidence that those whom they transact with are genuine, that they are not out there to profit exclusively amongst themselves. If you remember, for example, the concept of absolute gains versus relative gains. Okay, so it promotes confidence building. Then eventually, regimes, because of a common framework, since regimes are common frameworks, they reduce transaction costs, and it makes transactions easier among states in particular. No, it allows them, for example, we can call them, for sake of levity again, we can call them as discounts, or let's say kanang customer confidence, if that's how we view states, no? So they also provide enforcement mechanisms and norms of reciprocity. Take note of the term reciprocity, no, of let's say this is something like paying back, or something that is replicated, no? So you scratch my back, I scratch your back. This is how the world goes round here from the perspective of global governance. Reciprocity is very important, because when states feel that they are confident among themselves, that they can transact, then everyone else can feel safe, and they are incentivized to follow these norms, not to keep things running smoothly and to gain benefits along the way. So again, relative gains versus absolute gains. So in general, what we are seeing here right now is, basically there are different perspectives on global governance. But coming from the perspective of global governance in the form of international regimes, there might be differences in terms of how states view this, whether they view it from a very realist perspective, from the perspective of states pursuing their national interests at all costs, or from the liberalist perspectives, in which states can actually benefit alongside others, no matter how those benefits affect others, whether they profit more from others or not. So in this sense, again, this all boils down to the discussion on absolute gains versus relative gains. So in this way, we can see that states, as we see them today, and of course the other international actors of NGOs, IGOs, etc., they have their roles in global governance may differ, and they may have different interpretations as to their actions, etc., based on the paradigms of international relations. But what is crucial is the fact that global governance is a reality today, and it is still a growing, ongoing project. And more importantly, that individuals have a stake in this matter. We are not simply, let's say, in the background of all of this. Or is it simply that global governance is so abstract we cannot understand it? In fact, its impacts today in terms of how we live are very much felt. No? And we only need to look at various case studies to understand this. Now, I'd like to end this lecture on the note that there are going to be case studies for you guys in terms of understanding global, let's say, global international norms and regimes, etc. No? So there are many of these. And we're going to continue this discussion on global governance in another module, in another form. Let's say in module 6, for example, we have nationalism. No? So in this way, global governance is more of a it's more of a framework for us before we proceed with the other issues that we are going to tackle throughout this time, no, in the in the midterms period of our course. And so with that, thank you for listening, and I will catch you on the next one.